Now we turn to the 2016 presidential race. Senator Bernie Sanders swept the Washington, Hawaii, and Alaska caucuses yesterday by huge margins, 73% to 27% in Washington state, 82% to 18% in Alaska, and 71% to 29% in Hawaii. Joining us to talk about that and a very dramatic week in the Republican campaign is USA Today's Washington bureau chief Susan Page. Jeffrey Goldberg writes for The Atlantic. Slate's chief political correspondent and CBS News political analyst Jamelle Bouie. And Ben Domenech is the publisher of The Federalist. Jamelle, I want to start with you. Big night for Bernie Sanders. His best night of all.
Huge night.
Big deal, small deal?
Modest deal. It's very important that Bernie Sanders is doing extraordinarily well with liberals and progressives in the Democratic Party. Still doing very well with young people, and I think it sort of adds to the argument that Sanders' ideology, at least, represents the future of where the Democratic Party is going. But the fact remains that Hillary Clinton came into Saturday with a 300-plus delegate lead, that Bernie Sanders' huge wins doesn't meaningfully diminish that. And, you know, when the New York primary comes, for example, when the California primaries come, those primaries alone have as many delegates that were even as possible for Bernie Sanders to win on Saturday. And so the structure of the race still is in Hillary Clinton's favor, but that is not to say that Bernie Sanders' wins aren't very important for the kind of long-term movement he seems to be building.
Right. California and New York being states where Hillary Clinton might do better.
But it's also a situation that I think, you know, to your point, it does reveal something about the future of the Democratic Party and where the real excitement and passion lies. I mean, he goes to Portland and literally puts a bird on it and then wins, 3 of these states and then is going to go on to Wisconsin and to a lot of other states where he's going to continue to win in these wider northeastern states, do very well. And I think that speaks to some of the dissatisfaction among younger voters with Hillary Clinton and is going to be a problem for her when she gets to the general to inspire them again to come out for her, particularly if they have the feeling that this was taken away from them because of the superdelegate system.
I mean, what's the challenge here for managing the moment for Hillary Clinton?
Well, so Sanders has momentum and he'll have money, but he still doesn't have math on his favor. But it is, in a way, a preview, I think, of the challenges she may face in a general election against Donald Trump, if that's what happens. Because Donald Trump has enthusiasm, as Bernie Sanders does. He's a really spontaneous figure, even more so than Bernie Sanders is. And this is not the persona that Hillary Clinton projects, right? She's very careful and cautious. She's always well briefed. She speaks in full sentences.
She spells.
Low bar.
This is, yeah. So I think that it's a preview of her need to get more enthusiasm with people, especially young people. We've talked about that before. Her big deficit among voters under 30 is a problem that has been addressed, and it goes to her need to keep Bernie Sanders on her side. You know, she would like to turn to a general election. Democratic voters aren't ready to do that yet. Neither is Bernie Sanders. She needs Bernie Sanders speaking up for her once she finally has the nomination.
Once this is all done.
There is a strange quality to the moment in which the argument is, Bernie Sanders will never get to the White House if he keeps winning primaries and caucuses the way he's doing. It is this odd thing, but math is math. It is true.
I'll say I'm not sure that Hillary Clinton's going to have such a huge enthusiasm problem.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of politics in the modern period is driven by negative partisanship. It's not so much that Democrats are voting for Democrats and Republicans voting for Republicans, but Democrats are saying, I don't want those guys in the White House, and vice versa. And if there's anyone who's going to drive negative partisanship, it's Donald Trump. I think underplayed in a lot of the criticism of the media's handling of Trump is the fact that Trump is astoundingly unpopular with almost every single segment of the American population, other than the 35 to 40% of Republican voters that seem to really like him.
We're going to get to that because that's a very good point. Ben, this week we saw Hillary Clinton, as Susan was saying, pivoting to the general election. There was this terror attack. While Republicans were talking about waterboarding and surveilling neighborhoods, she was saying, no, this is sort of the adult approach. Is that a winning? Was it smart of her to grab that moment and do that?
I think to a certain extent that's fine. But on the other hand, when you look at what conversations were happening on the Republican side, I think that there is to the points that were made on the earlier panel, a real attitude of fear at this moment, a real feeling that kind of the elite leadership class's pieties about what's been going on in Europe over the past several years have been dismissed as being ineffective regarding the threats in nature. And I think because of that, people, particularly on the Republican side, are open to the kind of arguments that were being advanced by Trump. What's interesting to me, though, in this moment is the decisions that Trump has made this week, which seem to be completely at odds with my expectations for him at this moment. This is the moment for him to be unifying his party, bringing people together, convincing people that he can be trusted as a national security leader. And you saw that. I think that was actually the intent of his interviews with the Washington Post and with the New York Times. At the same time, he's engaging in baseless attacks on Ted Cruz's wife and on his campaign, very personal and very derogatory, that distracted from that. And he's ignoring the delegate selection process, where Ted Cruz was able to take over effectively the Louisiana process with all of his people. All of those things work to increase the likelihood that Trump would be unable to win on a second ballot should the Republican convention get to that point.
Let's separate those two things apart. Susan, we had this back and forth this week that we're not going to show the pictures, but a super PAC trying to go after Donald Trump ran a picture of his model wife in the Utah contest. Donald Trump responded by attacking Ted Cruz with an unflattering picture of his wife. This went right into the gutter where we thought the race was already existing. Does this matter, this back and forth? Does it hurt Donald Trump in a way? What do you make of this at the end of the week here?
Well, to talk short term and long term. Short term, I don't think this is, for people who support Donald Trump, this is just more Donald Trump. I don't think it's a big help to Ted Cruz. Gets him off message. This is not a reason people will vote for Ted Cruz. I think it's great news for Hillary Clinton because who are the most critical voters in general elections? Women, especially suburban women. And I think a lot of women will look at these exchanges and this debate over whose wife is prettier or who has the better marriage and think, this is not someone who I want to vote for.
Let me pick up on that point. If you look at, we're going to do some numbers here, and Jeffrey, I want you to respond. Donald Trump's net favorability rating among voters, according to our latest CBS poll, is a negative 33 in a general election context. That's lower than any recent nominee at this point in the race. But among women, it's even lower, negative 44. And just to put that into historical perspective, 4 years ago in March 2012, Mitt Romney's net favorability among women was only negative 13. So Donald Trump, Jeffrey, is 30 points more negative than a sort of generic Republican nominee would be with women. Isn't that glowingly toxic for him?
It's glowingly toxic for him, and you know, it goes to a broader point. I mean, Jamelle made this point in the piece the other day. It goes that the more people who are not already acolytes of Donald Trump hear him, the less popular he becomes. I think that's true on matters of international affairs and national security. It's certainly true in the context of his problem, his very obvious problem with women voters. It's very hard to imagine how he recovers from that. He cannot have a full personality transplant. Even if he did have a full personality transplant on these issues, it's very hard to sell that, I think, in the coming months.
I think that's key. It's sort of like swings in favorability happen within these relatively narrow margins. You can improve by 5 points if you're very good and lucky, 10 points in the general election. But a 30-point swing, a 40-point swing that Donald Trump would need to break even with the public just seems ridiculous. Like I'm having a hard time suppressing laughter.
By the way, there are battalions of people at Hillary Clinton headquarters who are studying this and gaming out exactly how to exploit that to make that problem for Trump even worse.
Right. Let's take a pause here, and we'll be back with more of this conversation with our panel. Stay with us. Ben, I want to start with you on this delegate question. Mm-hmm. Explain to people why it matters, what's going on.
So what's going on here is that even after all the votes are counted within these various states, such as a state like South Carolina or Louisiana, we still have a delegate selection process for the actual people who will go to the Republican convention. This matters a lot more should Donald Trump not achieve the 1237 number of delegates needed in order to clinch the nomination. If it goes to a second ballot where delegates are free to vote, the simple fact is that the Ted Cruz operation has been very focused on making sure that those delegates are Cruz supporters. And even if they are pledged to Trump in the original vote, that they would shift to him on a second ballot. They've been very successful in a lot of these early states, particularly because Trump's campaign is not even really engaged in the selection process.
So we have a two-front war here, really, Susan. We have the public contest that we're hearing about, but then there's this competition that's going on. What do you think the state of the Stop Trump movement is? How likely are they going to be to keep him from the delegates he needs?
Well, I totally agree. Trump needs to win on the first ballot or not at all. Mm-hmm. But I think he'll win on the first ballot. I mean, I think he's on a road to be at that 1237 or close enough that it will be impossible to deny to him. Because if you think about the fractures in the Republican Party, think about the fractures if Donald Trump, who won the most contests, who got the most votes, who got the most delegates, is denied the nomination by Republican elites. Can picture what that convention will be
I
like.
think, though, that there are some key figures in the Republican Party who are willing to put up with that anger because they feel that that same anger would be against them if he loses in the fall, which they expect him to do.
But if they had a better alternative, because they don't think Cruz is going to win in the fall either.
But they would, I think they'd rather lose with him.
Jamelle, what is John Kasich's role in life now? He's still in there, he's fighting, he says, but there are a lot of people continuing to say, stop it, because they want it to be a contest just between Ted Cruz and Donald Trump.
I mean, in Kasich's favor, the case that if he were not there, Cruz would win is not as strong as it looks. If various pollsters have looked at this, and some find that Cruz ends up ahead, some find that Trump ends up winning sort of in a straight fight. And so it's hard to say how it goes. I do think that with Kasich there, it definitely makes it more difficult for Cruz to even get to a point where he could challenge and beat Trump one-on-one. And in which case, I'm sort of with the Republican elites who want to get him out. And I don't know what Kasich thinks he's doing. He's not in a position, if it gets to a second ballot on the convention, for anyone to back him whatsoever.
Right. Jeffrey, I want to switch now to you. Donald Trump gave two interviews this week, one to the Washington Post editorial board, and then two sets of interviews with the New York Times, particularly on foreign policy. On the New York Times conversation, what did you glean from his foreign policy worldview?
I gleaned that he has no understanding of the post-war international order that was created by the United States, that he has no understanding of why we maintain alliances with such treaty partners as Japan, South Korea, Britain, NATO, and the importance of maintaining those stable relationships with our democracies. Shows that he has no understanding of nuclear doctrine. I mean, other than that, it was cool. It was really remarkable to imagine that someone who shows so little interest in understanding why the world is organized the way it is organized is this close to the presidency of the world's only superpower.
It's interesting. You look at the four candidates who you think might possibly be nominated, like Clinton and Sanders or Trump and Cruz, and there's only one who's in the mainstream of either Republican or Democratic foreign policy thought, and that's Clinton. Right. The others are in what would generally be considered kind of fringe positions on these issues. And so I thought it was interesting that George Shultz, attended the Hillary Clinton speech at Stanford about her worldview, and I wonder what kind of message that was intended to send.
Donald Trump name-checked George Shultz. He says as the Secretary of State he liked.
Yes, it's interesting to see. I agree with that frame. But again, doesn't that speak to the country's general rejection of what the foreign policy establishment has wrought over the past 15
I'm not
years?
sure.
I think it really does. I think it's basically saying it doesn't actually have an answer. It doesn't have an alternative answer. But it just says what you're doing isn't working. We don't trust you. We don't think that you actually are doing things any
But I think
better.
if you spend 10 seconds explaining to people why we have an alliance with South Korea and Japan, they generally will understand that. Maybe I'm
All right,
mistaken.
unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you all off just at the meaty moment. Thanks, all of you.